Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The New Normal. What does that mean for compliance? I'm Lois Engström, the marketing manager here at ClauseMatch, and today I'm joined by my colleague, Rich Haller, who's going to be moderating an excellent panel of industry experts. But before Rich gets started, let's go quickly through some key items. So this webinar is live. That means that you will all have an opportunity to ask the panelists a question. And you could do so by typing in your question on the right-hand side of the screen. We will then pick out a few of the questions to ask the panelists during our live Q&A in about 35 minutes time. This webinar is being recorded, so for all of you who have signed up to watch the webinar live with us today, you will receive an email later with a link to the recorded version. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion today. I'm going to hand it over to you, Rich, now to introduce the topic and the panelists.
Yes, good afternoon. Thanks everyone for joining. This is Rich Heller. I'm a Senior Vice President for Sales at ClauseMatch, and we're pleased to have a number of tremendous speakers today, and I'd like to have them introduce themselves. We'll start with Nirvana and then go to Ari and Michael. Nirvana?
Hi, I'm Nirvana Farhadi, and I was the former head of regulatory technology for Hitachi Vantara, and I've been in the industry in financial services for 20 plus years, so I've been about a bit.
Thank you.
I'm Ari. I'm an investor at Index Ventures in London. We're a global venture capital firm investing in software and internet businesses globally. I've been on the board of ClauseMatch for over 2 years now. Have quite a bit of experience with RegTech and software and enterprise software more broadly. So excited to be here.
Thank you, Ari. Michael?
Hello, I'm Michael Rasmussen of GRC 2020 Research. And I've got 27 years of experience now, and a law degree and business degree. And then most of my career I've been in the analyst world. So my job is to research the challenges of what organizations face in context of governance, risk management, and compliance, and how they go about solving those problems with strategy, process, and particularly technology.
Great. Great. Well, thanks to all of you for joining, and thanks for everyone for joining the webinar today. So to set the stage, again, during the recent pandemic, we've seen compliance teams have had to quickly pivot and manage the unforeseen risks and challenges, all while working remotely. So many regulated industries have been lagging when adopting to a more digitized way of working. And a lot of the tasks today we see, as many of you may realize, are manual, which has proven to be a bigger challenge, especially when they're trying to make sure everyone's following and being compliant with their governance. And so adding to those current challenges, the United States Department of Justice recently issued an updated guidance last month that specifically focused on the evaluation of corporate compliance programs. And many of you may have seen this. And the guidance centers around following 3 critical questions. One, is the corporation's compliance program well designed? 2, is that program adequately resourced and empowered to function effectively? And 3, does the compliance program work in practice? So as we move forward and organizations are starting to adopt and adapt to the new normal in their day-to-day operations, probably looking at a question of how they'll handle these new challenges and changes and the ways of impacting compliance teams across regulated industries. So with that, I wanted to start the dialogue off, and this is for Michael to start with, is what is the new normal and what are the implications of a new normal for compliance and risk professionals today?
Oh, the new normal is hitting us from lots of directions right now. We've got like COVID-19 and the pandemic and how is that going to impact compliance? We've got, greater regulatory change and things happening around there. The Department of Justice, evaluation of a compliance program guidelines. It's sort of like this perfect storm that's creating this new normal of compliance. that's hitting us from every direction right now. From my perspective, the new normal compliance is going to require greater efficiency. How can we do more with less resources? Time saved, money saved, FTE saved, things like that. The new normal is how do we make compliance efficient, at the same time making it effective? How can we make compliance more accurate, complete, thorough in the organization? But more particularly, how do we make compliance agile in a dynamic environment that demands agility? The business is constantly changing. Regulations are changing. Risks are changing. And we have to keep all this perspective in sync with each other. And that makes it exceptionally challenging. And we can devote a ton of resources to keep up with regulatory change, just like in financial services. I use Thomson Reuters figures, and there's 217 regulatory change events every business day of the year in 2019 on average. That's a lot of regulatory change. And we can be completely intelligent about the law and regulation, but that doesn't make us compliant if that business process has changed or that employee has changed roles and responsibilities. We have to keep all of this stuff in sync. So we need agile, we need efficient, effective, and agile compliance, which leads us to a greater need for technology. And this is very much illustrated in things like COVID-19 and the response to home workers. I've interacted with lots of companies that found our policy management systems are a mess. One financial services company I was talking to came into COVID-19 and said, we have over 20 different policy portals and home office expense policies, work from home policies, and IT security policies. And all these things are changing. At the same time, we have to remind GDPR policies and market conduct policies. And they said, when policies are in different templates and on 20 different portals, that's not helping us in this crisis where we need that singular point of communication. But we're also seeing technology change like with the Department of Justice guidelines and the evaluation of compliance programs. In which you read those guidelines, you're not going to do this alone. The only way to get what you need is through technology for the reporting requirements, the audit trail and system of record. I was just talking to a global bank a couple of weeks ago that in response to the Department of Justice guidelines, they feel that their SharePoint approach to like policies is not going to work for the future because it doesn't have the right audit trail and system of record on who accessed what policies and when they accessed it. It just isn't configured that way. So we're all seeing this, this new normal compliance is compliance that is efficient, effective, and agile. And with that, to achieve all those three elements enabled by technology.
Excellent. Thanks, Michael. That's great. So I think a lot of resiliency and agility from the perspective of the marketplace out there. I'd like to move over to Ari and kind of pose the same question and maybe take a look at it from what you're focused on, Ari. In what you're seeing in the industry as well from the new normal and the implications of that new normal for compliance and risk professionals.
Yeah, I think the interesting point about the perfect storm is that there was already an even bigger storm coming, which was the proliferation of regulation. There are 800 regulators globally. The pace of regulatory change was already going up. There was already a lot of pressure, and then COVID-19 hits, and that's been a huge accelerator. So across the board in the companies we speak to, when we're speaking to CIOs, chief risk officers, and other folks that are impacted, what they were telling us right at the beginning of the lockdowns was, look, we're just trying to keep the lights on. But then now what we're seeing is we're sort of moving from defense mode to offense mode in that folks are beginning to look for ways of building, long-term resilience. And folks that have been thinking about shifting their processes to the cloud, bringing, implementing software that would bring, audit trails, automation, better collaboration through cloud software are saying, we need this now because if this is going to be the new normal, if people are increasingly going to be working from home, you need to have modern software that allows you to manage that and allows you to stay on top of that. So I'd say the big takeaway for us in this has been that, well, we were worried that, software adoption was going to massively slow down, and it did for about 6 weeks. now it's really accelerating because, you know, the COVID-19 impact of having people working from home, needing to become more agile, has opened a lot of people's eyes to what the gaps were, and really kind of emphasize the need for, you know, modern cloud software that can bring, you know, transparency and better oversight to a lot of these processes.
Well said, Ari. I'd like to take it over to Nirvana and kind of give us your perspective on some of that business continuity and acceleration that Ari talked about, and maybe some of the perspective that you've heard out there with some of the folks you've been speaking to.
Sure, absolutely. So, you know, in terms of the new normal, I think, you know, we're going to see a lot more of us remotely working, and the new normal is going to be somebody's kid coming in the background, or the neighbor screaming in the background while you're trying to have a Zoom conference call, etc. Whilst there's, you know, potentially huge benefits, I guess, for a more permanent shift to this kind of environment, you know, less commuting and more flexible working arrangements, etc., managing and mitigating compliance risk is going to be quite difficult. In normal circumstances, we rely heavily on our compliance programs, infrastructure, our policies and procedures, training programs, etc., to keep things going. But what's happened right now with the pandemic, and, you know, the situation that we're in, it's accelerated our timeline even more so to embrace digital transformation, in the sense that if companies weren't doing it before, and we're not, you know, this isn't just impacting financial services, RegTech spans across any sector. You know, some sectors are more further behind. So they have to embrace that digital transformation. And I think one thing that we can have a key takeaway is that really embedding that compliance by design at the development stage of these softwares and products that are out there is the key way to go about it. And also, I think another challenge is, you know, ensuring how we're going to ensure that we've got more effective compliance programs that are still with the part of the ethics of the culture and the culture of the organizations, and how do we maintain that when you're working remotely, and how do you extend and expand that infrastructure to someone's home, you know, connectivity and those kind of issues. So there's a lot of challenges and a lot to go.
That's excellent. And I think I'm going to take one of your points and come right back at you, Nirvana, regarding, you know, the concept around, you know, the updated guidance from the DOJ playing a leading role in speeding up adapting technology. And I heard you mention, you know, one of the key questions that they ask in that guidance is a compliance program well designed? So to your point, you know, how do you see organizations adapting technology in light of the new DOJ guidance?
You know, I think it's actually quite encouraging to see that, because prior to this guidance coming out, and actually an example I'm going to give is of the GDPR, where it was kind of one of the first regulations that encourage that compliance by design at the development stage, right? It was one of the key elements of that. And we're seeing a lot more regulations being thought of and being produced, and policies and guidance being produced in that way, where the regulators are actually thinking about that, the compliance, and designing that in the development stage of the technologies and adopting that quicker. They've got a job to do too, right? So this is a challenge for them. They need to get their tech on board to make sure that they can properly safeguard the sector as well. So I think we're heading towards that, and it's certainly encouraging that it's coming from the regulators. But also, you know, I'll be honest with you, I've seen a lot of organizations where, you know, policies were just something to tick a box, and it was very much, you know, their interpretation of what they had in place, etc. I've seen some organizations with very good, robust policies and procedures in place, and some that, you know, it was so sporadic and all over the place that, you know, I'm not going to name names.
Understood. Thank you for that. Yeah, go ahead. Michael, I think were you going to say something? I'm sorry.
Oh,
yeah.
I was just going to comment also that, you know, as Nirvana said, there are organizations with good policies in place, but that's not enough. Having a well-written policy doesn't mean that you're compliant. People need to be aware of those policies. They have to be able to access those policies. I've got a code of conduct here on my laptop. It is the model code of conduct. Back in the year 2000, 20 years ago, other companies were copying this code of conduct to be their code of conduct. It was held up to be the perfect code of conduct. I had a petroleum company from Canada at one of my policy management workshops that told me that they nearly copied that code of conduct word for word. I'm talking about Enron's code of conduct. So having good policies is important, but those policies also need to be communicated and enforced and part of the embedded culture of the organization as well.
Exactly, yeah.
Sorry, just to add to that, it's again, I completely agree with Michael. You can have a book that's full of policies and procedures and handbooks and it's perfect, but if people are actually not applying that in practice, no point. So I think that needs to shift in terms of how it's applied, and it actually has to be implemented in action rather than just having a book and ticking a box.
Exactly, yeah, and I think those points are well made, and I think the DOJ guidance, a lot of organizations are looking at, and how are they making sure that compliance program is working in practice? So I think the points you both made were valid. Ari, kind of when you look at looking at the U.S. and European market, what differences are there when it comes to adapting to the recent changes? Maybe provide us some of your perspective on that.
So the main perspective from which I've been looking at this on a sort of transatlantic perspective has been on the data privacy regulation. So, there's new regulation that's come online in California. There's about 10, 11 states, individual US states that are bringing in similar regulation. 2 years ago, we had GDPR going live in Europe. I think we probably had a head start. In fact, I think the European experience of adapting to GDPR, which was such a huge leap in terms of process and in terms of gearing up to go live with that, I think gave us a lot of lessons, and I think we're about to see the same thing happen in the US now with new waves of regulation. Of course, regulation is nothing new, but I think just the increased volume of it and the breadth and the coverage, beyond even just financial services, but also in other industries, I think is something that's quite new. So I would say that there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the European experience now, that especially in the sort of data privacy space, but I think there are a lot of other regulations that this would apply for. I'd say that the key takeaway for me, having looked at GDPR playing out in Europe, has been the importance of not only robust process but also automation. The complexity is increasing exponentially, and if you don't have automation, it's very, very difficult to then monitor things properly. And to Nirvana's earlier point around, it's not enough just to have a bunch of well-written and well thought out policies. It's important to make sure that they're then connected to the relevant controls, that the controls are being properly followed and reviewed, etc. And so I'd say the big takeaway for me there has been automation, and that the key in Europe has been to drive this regulatory change via automation, and the folks that have been most successful at doing that have approached it with that mindset. And so I think that's going to be a really important lesson for the US market.
And Nirvana, did you want to talk a little bit more about the US landscape as far as what you've seen with regulatory regulations?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I've had the benefit of both sides of the pond. So, you know, I was very involved with the European regulatory environment when I was advising on MiFID, and worked with the European Commission and the task force, the regulatory task force. So it was a bit like the Eurovision Song Contest at the time. But what Europe proved, and I see over and over again, is in terms of the infrastructure that's been put in place to adhere to those regulations, it's a simpler process. You've got the directives, which, you know, each member state has some time to implement, but then you've got the regulations where there's no room for scope for interpretation, and you have to implement that as is. With the US, it's slightly more complex in that we see, you know, you've got state regulation, but you also have federal regulation as well. And a good example of this is, and you know, I'm not going off piece, there is a method to my madness, but the cannabis industry here, right? So states have adopted it in the RegTech sector, and there's regulations around that, etc. But at a federal level, it's not adopted yet. So that leaves a lot of challenges for individuals and organizations in that sector, and how they take the money, etc. So that's one of the differences, state and federal regulation adopting that, and how it's segmented and segregated in that sense. But another very simple thing, it might, you know, we take for granted in Europe, I mean, internet speed, connectivity, being able to, you know, when you're working remotely, I mentioned this yesterday when we were talking, you know, I live in California, and, you know, by all means, it's not a third world state or city whatsoever. I didn't have internet connection for a day. You know, that's impossible. How do you mitigate those kind of risks? You know, dropping off a SharePoint, and, you know, how are they going to monitor that, etc., in terms of a compliance angle? So there's even very simple challenges, but those are still key challenges where the infrastructure hasn't been built out yet to even take this into consideration. Does that make sense?
Yes, that was very good, and yeah, thank you for that. That's some great examples too. And Michael, I guess, you know, maybe speak to some of the things that you see. I know prior to all this, you traveled quite a bit all over the globe. You know, what are some of the differences you see out there between the European market and the U.S. market?
Well, there's similarities in the volume and veracity of regulatory change, but there's also differences in how it's approached. I mean, the U.S. is very much what we call a checklist or prescriptive approach to compliance. Organizations have this whole mentality of, tell me what I have to do, you know, give me the checklist, and let me check the check boxes, then I want my get out of jail free card. While over in Europe, you know, started with the FSA years ago, and then we went in the United Kingdom, moved over to the EU's better regulatory policy. You have more of a principles and outcome-based approach to regulation. You know, we're not going to exactly give you the checklist. We're going to tell you what you have to achieve. And the way one organization achieves it might be different from another organization. And so you have different mentalities in how compliance is approached, more rules, prescriptive, one more principles and outcome. But obviously there's little mixtures of all that as well. And in that role, I mean, there's a stronger integrated risk focus for compliance over in Europe. We're seeing more and more risk focus in the US, like with the Department of Justice guidelines, has a huge emphasis on risk assessment. But when you take a principles or outcome-based approach to compliance, it necessitates that there's a risk assessment process on how are we going to achieve that outcome. Because we don't have that checklist that's being handed to us. We need to come up with that. Further, we're seeing a completely different approaches in accountability. Over in Europe, well, the United Kingdom with UK SMCR, Ireland with SEER, but other parts of the world like Australia's BEAR or Hong Kong's managers in charge, we're seeing significant push on accountability regulations for compliance, where senior management functions can be held personally accountable. They can, in some matters, go to jail, but in a lot of areas where there's lack of due diligence or negligence, they can be personally fined for compliance issues. We don't have that same level of accountability in the U.S.
That's true. That's true. So, yeah, thank you for that. I think the area that we wanted to talk about next, and Michael, back to you, is really how is the new normal look like in compliance with how technology is helping those organizations to be able to manage through that, and what do you see in how they're looking at technology to help respond both to the DOJ as well as to maybe some other traditional problems they've had that the GRC solutions haven't been able to tackle?
Well, it's happening at multiple levels. One is particularly from that system of record and audit trail. And you look at the DOJ guidance, and you need to be able to demonstrate, how that compliance program was effective, and that it was properly resourced, and that it gets into the audit trail and system of record on the areas of policies: who accessed the policy, who read the policy, who attested the policy, how was it understood, who was trained properly, having that document record of compliance. Which, if you try to do that in document spreadsheets and emails, you can never fully achieve that. I can create a completely fictitious story of compliance in document spreadsheets and emails. They want to see what was assessed, what date and time, who was communicated policy, what date and time, and have that be able to stand up in court. And so defensible system of record and audit trails technology provides. Technology provides greater efficiency, effectiveness, and agility. I was talking to one mid-sized bank here in the United States, helping them with their RFP. And they said that they did an internal study and found that 80% of their staff time in compliance was nothing more than document reconcilers. They are trying to manage hundreds to thousands of documents, spreadsheets, and emails on policies, policy communications, compliance assessments, and all this. 80% of their staff time is just trying to manage documents, not managing compliance. And they wanted to turn that around. Another company I talked to is spending 200 hours trying to build a compliance report for the board of directors. One employee, 5 full weeks of time at a 40-hour work week to build one compliance report once a year for the board of directors. That's not managing compliance, that's reacting to compliance. They're literally combing through, thousands of different documents, spreadsheets, and emails to tabulate and aggregate and provide all this information. They found out that we have a compliance issue that started 11 months ago, and it's grown to become a bigger compliance issue. And they're not finding that out until they spend 200 hours building one report at the end of the year on compliance. That's not managing compliance, that's reacting to compliance. Now they have that same report at a push of a button.
Well, yeah, it's mind blowing in that they're doing the same things they've done for the last 30 years almost. It sounds like, with spreadsheets and Word documents. Nirvana, what are you seeing as far as some of the technology that's helping people manage their compliance today?
I'm seeing a lot of development out there and a lot of new technology that's coming out. Prior to the pandemic, we were slowly heading towards this fear of a recession coming. So a lot of departments got rid of the RegTech departments, their innovation departments, etc. And then suddenly everyone's like, oh my goodness, now we need something. We need to think about R&D. We need to think about developing this. I've seen examples of technology which is quite sophisticated in how it addresses monitoring trading remotely, in terms of compliance monitoring for traders, etc., using facial recognition technology as well as voice recognition. And it's a very fascinating way to deal with those compliance challenges that you have with remote trading, for example. So we're seeing a lot of that. But I think what people need to understand is, when RegTech, we started RegTech in financial services. Everybody kept calling it a buzzword, and and every year after year, I go to various conferences, and everybody is like, "Well, what are the trends? What are we going to do? What's the market size and opportunity?" We're beyond that, people. RegTech is here to stay. This is what needs to be adopted. Technology has to be adopted with compliance at the forefront of its processes and how it's embedded in the technology. And that's the only way we're going to go forward. So it will, to Michael's point, it's going to bring agility, it's going to reduce costs and compliance and risk burdens for organizations. So, it's here to stay. Let's get on with it and get used to it.
Great, thank you. Yeah. I think, Ari, when you were talking about acceleration and adoption and for business continuity, what are some of the things that you're seeing in there for managing compliance?
So I really like Michael's point about, reacting to compliance versus managing compliance. And I think that's a really important distinction. So if we sort of rewind to the first kind of regtech software that came out, it was purely just taking your Excel based, document based workflows and putting a bit of software around it and maybe making it a little bit collaborative. I think what we're seeing now is in the moving away from sort of that reactive approach to compliance into a more proactive approach. New technologies are using large-scale data aggregation, advanced analytics, machine learning to surface issues in real time as they come up, and this is what then allows you to increase the pace of innovation. So I think the thing that's often missed when people talk about regtech is that it's seen as a cost base, it's seen as a cost center, right? You're looking at, how can I kind of reduce my cost of compliance? But that's not really the most important business impact of implementing, great regulatory automation. The big benefit you get is that you can start moving more faster as a business as a whole, right? So when we're looking at, so we have a big portfolio of fintech companies, for example, Revolut, who are used by CauseMatch, for example, and or who use CauseMatch, and a bunch of other kind of challenger financial services companies, and a lot of those are essentially just exploiting this this weakness that that more established incumbents have, which is they can't move as fast. And one key piece of being able to move fast is to be able to turn compliance from being a blocker to being something that enables innovation. And the only way you can do that is by introducing a high level of automation, so that you can be proactive about it and so that it doesn't hold you back. We work with a company called Behaviox, for example, that uses advances in natural language processing to monitor traders and to proactively monitor communications within an organization for potential breaches, a bit in the sort of vein of what you were talking about, Nirvana. So yeah, lots of sort of interesting approaches there, but I think the fundamental thing that we're seeing is this shift away from reactive towards a more proactive approach to managing this, because ultimately, if you're just reacting, you're always on the back foot. Compliance is always going to be the thing that sort of holds you back from innovating. And as we know, the businesses that are going to win in the next 10 years are the ones with a high pace of innovation. And so I think, that's the context in which we look at the whole space, and the lens through which we, assess new opportunities in regtech is, are they enabling that ultimate business goal of faster innovation or not? And that's really how, senior management and leaders should be thinking about this, not as a cost center, but rather as an important enabler of the core business.
Very, very good. Thanks, Ari. And we do have a couple of questions, and it's kind of along that same theme. One of the questions we had was, what type of technology in compliance do you see organizations are shifting their focus into actually trying to digitize or digitally transform? So I'll open that up to any of you that want to respond, but maybe you can provide some insight into what you're seeing out there.
I would definitely say, policy management technology is one of them. Being able to particularly communicate and have that system of record to engage the front lines of the organization, as well as the back office of the organization to keep those policies current. Connected to that is regulatory change technology to take in the volume of regulatory change and then identify the processes and behavior and therefore policies that need to change in the organization. I mean, there's definitely compliance risk assessment and compliance assessment type technologies out there, as well as investigations and case management type technologies to manage the issues in the organization.
Excellent. Yeah, that's very good. And I guess, I know they're trying to move off the SharePoint and Excel, and Word into different platforms to automate all of that. I guess to the question into, you know, talking about innovation and machine learning and natural language processing, you know, there's a lot of talk about those buzzwords. Are you know, banks mid-size, large size, are they looking at that? Is that a buzzword you hear out there? Maybe Nirvana, have you heard that from other financial institutions? Or Michael?
I mean, definitely. I see a lot of the role of the artificial intelligence in those technologies I just mentioned, like regulatory change and policy management. I see a lot of need and emphasis, particularly, you know, how do we manage that? I mean, if there's 217 regulatory change events every business day in financial services coming from nearly, you know, 1,000 regulators, you know, that's a lot of man hours to do that manually. How can we leverage natural language processing, you know, cognitive type technologies that can read those changes and identify and suggest you should look at this, this, and this. Humans still need to be involved in the process, but technology makes it extremely more efficient.
And just to add to that, sorry, I was on mute when you called my name out, but just to add to that, you know, we have to remember that really regulation needs to act as a filter through which technology can flow through and compliance can be embedded, right? And if we think of it that way, that's really essentially what RegTech is. It's not there, regulation is not there to, you know, prohibit anything from going on. It's there to act as a filter and a safeguard. And, you know, through that, you know, like to Michael's point, for example, you know, we can't be reactive anymore. If we think of regulation as a filter, and if we think of implementing compliance at the design phase, then, you know, we're going to be less reactive and more proactive in how we address these changes.
Yeah, that's good. We do have another question here. Question is, the challenge remains for compliance to define what it means to be effective. Harvard Business Review reported that over 70% of companies do not measure their effectiveness. How does technology better address this? Who wants to take that?
Sorry, can you repeat the question again, please? It was a bit...
Sorry, yeah. So the question was around, you know, Harvard Business Review reported that 70% of companies do not measure their effectiveness. And, you know, the challenge remains for compliance to define what it means to be effective. So how, you know, how does technology better address the ability to measure their effectiveness?
You know, compliance has always been a cost center for organizations. They don't generate revenue. And when you're a bank or a financial services institution, compliance is not a, you know, that's not your core business. Your core business is to generate revenue. And a lot of organizations that I am working with are now using technology for their compliance departments to better, I guess, to enhance their brand, right, as a compliance department from a marketing perspective, and saying, you know, well, this is what we're doing and we're adapting these technologies to help the processes. So they almost are trying to sell their reason why they're there in some organizations by using more sophisticated technology. But in a lot of other more institutionalized organizations, compliance is still on the back foot. So it does become quite difficult to kind of measure that, and they're still being reactive rather than proactive. Back in the day, it used to be, you know, the compliance department would say, you need to implement this change, this is coming down the line. Then we saw that reverse, whereas it was other areas of the business that were actually starting to implement certain changes. So I think it's difficult to measure that, but I think when you're seeing it go forward, it's more of a justification for their existence in a lot of cases, and using technology to justify their existence because it's helping them to reduce costs and burdens. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Definitely does. There's a lot of options out there. And yeah, Ari, did you have something you wanted to add to that? It looked like you were about to say something.
Yeah, just I mean, just on that point, I think in order to be able to measure what's going on in the organization, you need to have good data, And the only way you get good data is by having, you know, modern software that can do the data aggregation, where you can get, you know, all the analytics that you care about. And so while that doesn't address the question of how do you define success and efficiency and effectiveness in a compliance organization, which I'm not qualified to answer, I would say that the first step towards getting there is to have the data all in one place in a format that's straightforward to query, and that then enables you to define whatever benchmarks or KPIs you think are relevant for your organization.
There's no doubt about it. Compliance needs a stronger strategy, process, and technology. And a lot of time and effort needs to go into, and how do we evolve compliance? Where are we at now with our current state? Where do we want to be at the future state in the next year to 2 years? And how are we going to get there? And there's a critical role for technology specifically enabling those processes. And part of building that business case, you need to break down those processes and look at how can I make things more efficient, effective, and agile in the organization along those aspects. There's lots and lots of different types of compliance technologies, but some are very niched and rather locked in and not very agile and flexible in what they can do for the organization. So you need to be able to approach this and think strategically, like what technologies out there for compliance can really give me the most efficiency, effectiveness, and agility in the organization.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Clause Match just had the opportunity, as many of you may be aware, where we were part of the FinTech Innovation Lab with the Partnership for New York and Accenture, and we're part of that innovation lab. And as a part of that process, we were very actively involved in the earlier stages of large financial institutions evaluating technology. So to all of your point around, looking early on and designing and understanding the gaps that you look at, and then, trying to identify how they can drive resiliency and agility into that process. There's been some very thoughtful analysis of that. And I think, having the DOJ guidance, I know they provide this typically on an annual basis, it provided some more impetus for that. Do any of you see any other impacts, maybe here in the US or in the UK, of maybe some things that are coming down the road in the next 6 to 12 months that, companies are trying to stay on top of from a regulatory standpoint?
I think COVID is something they're still trying to stay on top of, right?
Yeah,
I've just seen, my brother works for a bank, a very well-known bank. They got them all to go back into work again. And within 2 days of them being back at work, they were sent back home again because they were exposed to somebody who had COVID symptoms. And for 14 days, they had to quarantine themselves. So I think for a while, this thing is here for a while yet to come. So I think it's going to keep people on their toes. And we are seeing some kind of flexibility around some of the regulations coming down the pipeline in terms of the timing where they're going to hit, I think, because this whole pandemic situation is really keeping people preoccupied. But just another point, a point on the previous point that was mentioned in terms of assessing compliance. Ari mentioned something very important, which is data. So if you've got data, if you've got garbage in, you get garbage out. So the data and the data quality is absolutely important. But one thing I did want to also say is that a lot of organizations and a lot of vendors I see, they're very much focusing on the niche products like Michael mentioned earlier. But we need to kind of think about this outside of those silos and how it impacts other areas as well. So if you're looking at GDPR, well, look at how it impacts other regulations. And, as a compliance officer, with previous life as a compliance officer, I had so many different vendors and, connection points that I need to connect to and service level agreements, and it was a nightmare. So, easing that burden as well in terms of when you're developing solutions and products, just don't think of that particular, it's an anti-money laundering product. It can, but with technology, it can be applied to other areas, and it should be, so that it's more holistic.
That's a great point. Yeah, I think we see that with a number of different organizations that are trying to manage the impact of a new regulation and how it impacts a policy, a procedure, a control, and how does that, where those connections lie and how quickly can you analyze that? And certainly technology can help. Any other thoughts from Michael or Ari that you had regarding, maybe we can talk a little bit, one final question that came across just now is, do you see a difference in the maturity of adoption of technology, as we look at the comparison between the US and the UK or Europe?
So I would say on the maturity question, the major difference is that US organizations tend to be much faster to adopt new technology. And I think while RegTech sort of specifically has had a bit of a sort of a head start in Europe, I think what we see in the US is that decision makers are just much faster to try new things and to adopt new technology. And that's true across the board. I mean, that's the case with pretty much every, I sit on 7 software company boards, and pretty much all of those find the sales cycles, faster and easier to navigate in the US. And so I'd say that would be the bigger difference, is just the sort of the speed of adoption tends to be higher, and the willingness to sort of take risk and try new approaches and new solutions tends to be higher in the US than in Europe.
But Ari, they still use checks out here.
That's true, actually.
It fascinates me, to your point, right? So, yeah. One of the banks...
There are some holdouts. Yeah.
Exactly. So one of the banks that I use, they have an amazing front end and a AI and chatbot, etc. It's fantastic. And then you go to the other bank and they're still writing checks and they're making you write checks. So I think, we're seeing more speed to adoption here, but also they've got a lot further to go. I think Europe are kind of ahead as well in that sense.
I think there's pluses and minuses to both sides of the Atlantic. I think there's some great advancements in RegTech in London particularly, but throughout Europe. I'm seeing a lot of interest in technologies, more of a business process focus there. The US, I think, is quicker to the draw on technology at times, but it's not always as well thought out. And so I see that quite often where people aren't thinking strategically about technology, they're thinking reactively. I need to solve this, give me a hammer to hammer the nail. They're looking more strategically on just how do I address this problem, and from more of a reactive point of view. And instead of thinking about it strategically, how can I actually find a solution that can address not only this problem, but this problem, this problem, this problem. Because
I agree with
some technology is very locked in and it doesn't get you very far.
Absolutely. And just one point to what you mentioned about the UK and seeing more sophistication. I think a plus side for the UK is the UK regulator. They're very much into regulatory technology and putting the work in with the ecosystem to make sure that they've got the right solutions out there and they're working holistically. It's, not that the regulators don't do that here, but it's still they've got a long way to go.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah, the regulators are a little more siloed here, here in the U.S. Excellent point. Well, I think we've come to the end of our time. Thank you to a wonderful panel, Nirvana, Ari, and Michael. Thank you so much for a tremendous time. We covered a lot of ground. We've talked a lot about the new normal, which is getting to be just the normal. I know that there's a lot going on with the changing regulations. But we really appreciate everyone's taking time today for this webinar, and I'll turn it back over to Lois.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rich. Nirvana, Michael, Ari, thank you so much for sharing your insights and knowledge with us today. To everyone who is listening, I hope you enjoyed this discussion. We are running several webinars and you can check them all out on clausematch.com. We hope you will join us again soon. Please do take care and have a nice day.